Charles Whitman built his fortune on recognizing faces, reading people, making split-second decisions worth millions. But the face staring back at him from under that hard hat made his world stop. Every feature belonged to Lucy, his daughter who'd been missing for 15 years. Every detail matched except one impossible fact: this woman was black. As Charles stepped closer, his mind raced through explanations that made no sense. Adoption. Memory loss. Something darker? What he was about to discover would prove that sometimes the truth doesn't set you free, it buries you alive. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back 2 hours before, where it all started. But that recognition was still 20 minutes away. Charles stepped out of his silver Bentley onto the cracked asphalt of the Riverside construction site at 7:43 a.m. Gray October clouds hung low over Detroit like dirty cotton, and the air tasted of rust and diesel exhaust. At 52, Charles moved with the calculated precision of a man who owned 17 companies across 4 states. His navy wool coat cost more than most people made in a month, but money had never filled the hollow space in his chest where his heart used to live. "Morning, Mr. Whitman." Jake Morrison, the site foreman, approached with a clipboard and nervous energy. "Ready for the walkthrough?" Charles nodded without looking at him. His pale blue eyes swept across the construction zone where his latest hotel would rise from the bones of an old auto plant. Workers in bright orange vests moved like ants across steel beams and concrete foundations. The crash of sledgehammers against brick walls echoed off nearby buildings. Lucy would be 28 now. The thought hit him like it always did. Unexpected and vicious. Charles pressed his lips together and forced his attention back to Jake's rambling about electrical permits and foundation pours. But his mind drifted to the framed photo on his office desk. Lucy at 13, gap-toothed and laughing, her auburn curls catching sunlight in their backyard in Bloomfield Hills. 3 weeks later, she was gone. "The demolition crew is making excellent progress," Jake was saying. "We should have the interior walls down by Thursday." Charles barely heard him. He never should have come to the site today. Board meetings and quarterly reports felt safer than construction zones where young people worked with their hands, reminding him of Lucy's dream to become an architect. She used to build elaborate structures with Legos, her small fingers positioning each piece with architectural precision. "Stop." Charles pulled out his phone and checked his messages. 3 missed calls from his assistant Beverly, probably about the foundation board meeting at 2. The Charles Whitman Foundation for Missing Children had raised $12 million last year. $12 million that brought other families closure while his daughter remained a ghost. Across the site, near the old factory's eastern wall, a demolition crew attacked a stubborn section of brick with sledgehammers. Charles found himself watching their rhythm. Lift, swing, impact, repeat. Methodical destruction. Sometimes he envied them. Their problems could be solved with enough force. "Sir." Jake touched his elbow. "Should we move to the foundation area?" 20 feet away, a young woman swung her sledgehammer with perfect form. Even from a distance, Charles could see the power in her shoulders as she pivoted her hips into each strike. She wore faded jeans and work boots. Her bright yellow safety vest stretched across a lean frame. A purple bandana covered her hair beneath the white hard hat. Something about her posture made Charles pause. The way she stood with her feet planted wide, completely focused on her task. Lucy used to stand exactly like that when she concentrated on her Lego buildings, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth. The young woman paused to wipe sweat from her forehead. She was small but moved with the confidence of someone who had fought for everything she owned. When she lifted her sledgehammer again, Charles noticed the grace in her movements. Part dancer, part warrior. "Who's that?" Charles asked, pointing toward the demolition crew. Jake squinted. "Which one?" "The young woman. Purple bandana." "Oh, that's Keisha Johnson. Been with us about 6 months. Hell of a worker. Shows up early, stays late, never complains." Jake checked his clipboard. "Why?" Charles didn't answer. Something about the way she held herself reminded him of Lucy's fierce independence. Even as a child, Lucy had insisted on doing everything herself. Tying her shoes, making her bed, building those elaborate Lego cities without help. What would you think of all this, baby girl? The construction site stretched across 4 city blocks, all concrete and steel and raw ambition. In 2 years, it would be the Whitman Grand Detroit, another monument to his success. But success felt hollow when you had no one to share it with. His ex-wife Patricia lived in California now with her new husband, and they barely spoke except through lawyers about foundation business. Charles started walking toward the demolition crew, ignoring Jake's protests about safety protocols. He needed a closer look at the young woman who moved like his daughter. As he approached, he could see her more clearly. She was probably in her early 20s, with rich brown skin that glistened with honest sweat. Her arms were lean and muscled from months of physical labor. There was something beautiful about her focus, the way she attacked each section of wall like it had personally wronged her. Keisha, called another worker, a heavy-set man with gray stubble. Boss wants this section cleared by lunch. I got it, Tommy. Her voice carried across the construction noise. Strong, clear, with a slight rasp that suggested someone who didn't waste words. Charles stopped about 15 feet away, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid attention. Workers streamed around him, but his focus narrowed to the young woman systematically demolishing a wall that had stood for 60 years. She moved with economy and purpose. No wasted motion. Every swing of the sledgehammer counted. Chips of brick and mortar scattered around her boots as she carved a path through decades of industrial history. Lucy would have loved this, Charles thought. The destruction, the creation, the transformation of space. The thought should have hurt, but instead it felt almost comforting. For 15 years, he had avoided places that reminded him of his daughter. Construction sites, schools, anywhere young people gathered with dreams and energy. But watching this young woman work stirred something in him besides grief. Hope was too strong a word. But maybe curiosity. The sledgehammer caught on a particularly stubborn section of mortar. Keisha paused, studied the wall, then adjusted her angle. 3 precise strikes opened a crack that spread like lightning across the brick face. She stepped back as a section collapsed in a satisfying crash. Nice work, Johnson. Tommy called out. Keisha nodded but didn't smile. She just moved to the next section and started swinging again. Charles felt his phone buzzing but ignored it. Beverly could wait. The board meeting could wait. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely interested in something happening right in front of him. The young woman's dedication reminded him of his own early days in construction, back when he still swung hammers instead of signing checks. Before Lucy. Before Patricia. Before wealth insulated him from the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. What's your story? Charles wondered, watching Keisha work. Where did you come from? What are you trying to build? He checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. The board meeting wasn't until 2. He had time to stay and observe, though he couldn't explain why he wanted to. Something about this young woman called to him. Maybe it was her fierce independence. Maybe it was the way she attacked problems head-on instead of delegating them to others. Maybe it was just the ache of missing his daughter on another gray Detroit morning. Whatever it was, Charles found himself unwilling to leave. He pulled out his phone and texted Beverly, running late. Start the meeting without me. For once, business could wait. Something more important was happening on the demolition site, though Charles couldn't yet name what it was. He just knew he needed to stay and watch the young woman work. Tell me your story, he thought, as Keisha's sledgehammer rang against brick in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Charles had been watching Keisha work for 32 minutes when she finally stopped to catch her breath. She set down her sledgehammer and walked toward a cooler near the equipment trailer. Her movements were fluid despite the heavy work boots and safety gear. As she bent to grab a water bottle, her purple bandana shifted, revealing small silver hoop earrings that caught the weak morning light. Charles found himself moving closer without conscious decision. His Italian leather shoes crunched across debris and gravel as he navigated around power tools and stacks of rebar. Jake called after him about hard hat requirements, but Charles barely heard. Keisha straightened and took a long drink of water. She tilted her head back, exposing the elegant line of her throat. In profile, something about the curve of her nose, the shape of her chin, made Charles's breath stick in his chest. She looked so much like Lucy. Not exactly. This young woman was black, with darker skin and different hair texture than his daughter's auburn curls. But the bone structure, the way she held herself, the stubborn set of her jaw when concentrating. Lucy had made that exact expression when frustrated with a particularly challenging Lego build. Charles stopped about 8 feet away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. This young woman had Lucy's nose, straight and narrow with a slight upturn at the tip. She had Lucy's chin, pointed but strong. She had Lucy's ears, small and close to her head. This is impossible. But Charles had memorized every detail of his daughter's face. He had spent 15 years studying photographs, searching crowds, following false leads from well-meaning strangers who claimed they had seen her. He knew Lucy's features better than his own. Keisha finished drinking and wiped her mouth with the back of her work glove. As she turned to head back to the demolition site, she noticed Charles standing nearby. Her expression shifted instantly from relaxed to guarded. "Can I help you with something?" Her voice carried authority despite her youth. No deference to his expensive clothes or obvious wealth. Charles opened his mouth but no words came. He stared at her face, drinking in details that made his chest feel like it might explode. The shape of her eyebrows. The way her left eye was slightly smaller than her right. The tiny scar above her upper lip. Lucy had that exact same scar from falling off her bicycle at age 7. "Sir." Keisha's tone sharpened. "You need something?" Charles forced himself to speak. "I'm sorry. I'm Charles Whitman. I own this project." "Okay." She didn't extend her hand or move closer. "Is there a problem with the work?" No problem." Charles struggled to organize his thoughts. "You're doing excellent work. I was just observing." Keisha's dark eyes studied his face with uncomfortable intensity. She was probably wondering why the billionaire owner was standing in a construction zone staring at her instead of attending board meetings. "Your name is Keisha?" Charles asked. "Keisha Johnson." She shifted her weight, clearly wanting to end this conversation and return to work. "How old are you, Keisha?" Her eyebrows pulled together in a frown. 23. "Why?" 23. Lucy would be 28 now, but genetics could be tricky. Maybe this young woman was younger than she looked. Maybe. "Where are you from originally?" Now Keisha's expression turned suspicious. "Look, Mr. Whitman, I don't know what this is about, but I got work to do. Tommy's expecting this wall down by lunch. Please." The word came out sharper than Charles intended. "Just humor me for a moment. Where were you born?" "Detroit." Keisha took a step backward. "Born and raised. Is there a point to this?" Charles felt the world tilting around him. Detroit. Lucy had disappeared from Bloomfield Hills, less than 20 miles from here. 15 years ago. The timing could work. The age could work. The location definitely worked. "Do you know who your birth parents are?" The question tumbled out before Charles could stop it. Keisha went very still. "Excuse me. I'm sorry, I know that's personal. But you remind me of someone. Very strongly." "Yeah." Keisha's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Who's that?" Charles hesitated. How could he explain that she looked exactly like his missing daughter? How could he tell this proud young woman that he wondered if she might be the child he had lost 15 years ago? "My daughter," he said quietly. Keisha stared at him for a long moment. Then she let out a harsh laugh. "Your daughter? Man, what the hell is wrong with you? I know how it sounds." "Do you?" Keisha stepped closer, her earlier wariness replaced by anger. "Rich white man tells black woman she reminds him of his daughter? You know how that sounds." Charles felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Keisha's voice carried across the construction site, drawing attention from nearby workers. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you got some kind of fantasy going on." "No, listen to me." Charles raised his hands placatingly. My daughter disappeared 15 years ago. She was 13. You have her facial structure, her expressions. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. I'm wondering if you might actually be her." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an explosion. Keisha stared at him with an expression Charles couldn't read. Shock. Anger. Something else entirely? "You think I'm your missing white daughter?" Her voice was deadly quiet. "I know it sounds crazy." Crazy. Keisha let out another laugh, but this one had no humor in it. "Mister, that's beyond crazy. That's insulting. I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to understand why you look so much like Lucy." Lucy. Keisha repeated the name like it tasted bitter. "That's her name." "Yes. Lucy Whitman. She disappeared on November 3rd, 2009. She would be 28 now, but you could be younger than you look." "Stop." Keisha held up her hand. "Just stop talking." Charles fell silent, his heart pounding. Around them, construction work continued, but he felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them standing in a bubble of impossible tension. Keisha studied his face with new intensity. Whatever she saw there made her expression soften slightly from anger to something closer to pity. "You really believe this, don't you?" she said quietly. "I know it sounds insane, but the resemblance is remarkable. And the timing, the location." "I'm not your daughter." Keisha's voice was firm but not unkind. "I know exactly who I am and where I came from." "Are you certain? Sometimes adoption records are sealed or—" "I said I'm not your daughter." Keisha picked up her sledgehammer. "And even if I was, what makes you think I'd want anything to do with a man who lost his kid and spent 15 years looking for her in the faces of strangers?" The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He stepped backward, feeling like she had struck him in the chest. "That's not. I haven't been looking. I gave up looking years ago. But here you are." Keisha hefted the sledgehammer onto her shoulder. "Looking." Charles stood there speechless as she walked back toward the partially demolished wall. She moved with the same confident stride, but something had changed between them. The air itself felt different, charged with possibility and pain. What if she is Lucy? The thought sent electricity through his nervous system. What if, after 15 years of private investigators and false leads and sleepless nights, his daughter had been working construction 20 miles from where she disappeared? What if she's not? That thought hurt worse. Because for 37 minutes, Charles had allowed himself to hope. For 37 minutes, the hollow space in his chest had felt almost full. Keisha reached the wall and raised her sledgehammer. Before she could swing, she looked back at him across the construction site. Their eyes met for a moment that stretched like taffy. Then she whispered something that Charles couldn't hear over the construction noise, but he could read on her lips. "Lucy." She was testing the name, seeing how it felt in her mouth. Charles's vision blurred. His hands started shaking. Because for just an instant, Keisha Johnson looked exactly like his 13-year-old daughter saying her own name. Dear God. The sledgehammer hit the brick wall with a sound like thunder, and Charles felt his carefully constructed world begin to crack along lines he hadn't known existed. Keisha had been trying to forget Charles Whitman's face for 48 hours, but the man haunted her like smoke. She stood in the break room trailer at 6:30 a.m., stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon and staring out the small window at the construction site. The other workers wouldn't arrive for another hour, which was exactly how she liked it. Early mornings gave her time to think without Tommy's constant chatter or the younger guys trying to prove how tough they were. But thinking was dangerous territory right now. Lucy. The name had been rolling around in her head since Tuesday morning. She'd caught herself whispering it while brushing her teeth, testing how it felt on her tongue. Different than Keisha. Softer. More white. Stop it. Keisha took a sip of coffee and winced at the bitter taste. She'd been drinking coffee black since she was 16 and started working construction cleanup jobs after school. Sugar and cream were luxuries she couldn't afford then, and old habits died hard even when you had steady work. The trailer door banged open, making her jump. Tommy walked in, already talking before he saw her. Keisha, girl, you won't believe what happened at the Tigers game last night. He stopped mid-sentence. Damn, you're here early. Everything okay? Everything's fine. Keisha turned away from the window. Just couldn't sleep. Tommy studied her face with the concern of someone who'd been looking out for her since she started at Riverside Construction. At 58, with gray stubble and kind eyes, he reminded her of what a father might be like if she'd ever had one. You sure? You've been acting strange since that rich guy came around Tuesday. Keisha's jaw tightened. I'm fine, Tommy. Because if he said something inappropriate. He didn't. The lie came easily. Charles Whitman hadn't said anything inappropriate in the usual sense. But believing she might be his missing daughter? That felt like the most inappropriate thing anyone had ever suggested. Good. Tommy poured himself coffee from the ancient pot. Rich folks got different rules, you know? Think their money means they can say whatever they want to working people. Keisha nodded but didn't respond. She couldn't explain that Charles hadn't acted entitled or condescending. He'd seemed genuinely desperate, like a man drowning who thought she might be his life preserver. You think I'm your missing white daughter? The memory of her own words made her stomach clench. She'd been angry, and rightfully so. Some rich white man thinking he could claim her based on facial resemblance was exactly the kind of thing that made her blood boil. But the look in his eyes. Stop. Keisha drained her coffee cup and headed for the door. I'm going to start on the east wall. Keisha. Tommy's voice stopped her. That guy comes around again, you let me know, okay? She nodded and stepped into the cool October morning. Detroit was waking up around her, traffic building on nearby streets, the distant sound of the morning shift change at the Ford plant, the familiar smell of industrial coffee and diesel exhaust. This was her world. Real work, honest pay, people who judged you by what you produced instead of what you looked like or where you came from. She'd fought for 6 months to earn respect on this crew, proving she could swing a hammer as hard as any man and show up every day without complaint. She wasn't about to let some grieving billionaire mess that up. Keisha grabbed her sledgehammer and safety gear from the tool shed. The weight of the hammer felt good in her hands. Solid, predictable, something she could control. Unlike the churning in her stomach every time she thought about Charles Whitman's desperate eyes. My daughter disappeared 15 years ago. Keisha had done the math despite herself. 15 years ago, she would have been 8 years old. Old enough to remember being someone else if she really was his missing Lucy. But she remembered her childhood clearly. Foster homes, social workers, aging out of the system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and determination to never depend on anyone again. She knew exactly who she was and where she'd come from. Do you know who your birth parents are? That question had hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. Keisha's adoption records were sealed. Had been since she was placed in foster care as an infant. She'd never tried to open them, never wanted to know about people who had given her away. But sometimes she wondered about her medical history, about genetic predispositions she might need to worry about. She'd never wondered if her birth parents might be rich white people. Keisha reached the partially demolished east wall and started swinging. The rhythm of destruction helped quiet her mind. Lift, pivot, strike, repeat. Each blow sent vibrations up her arms and satisfaction through her chest. Problems that could be solved with physical force were her favorite kind. 20 minutes into her work, she heard expensive shoes on gravel behind her. No. Keisha didn't turn around, just kept swinging at the brick wall with increased intensity. Maybe if she ignored him, Charles Whitman would take the hint and leave her alone. Keisha. His voice was softer than Tuesday, less demanding. But hearing her name in his mouth still made her skin crawl. I'm working, she said without stopping. I know. I'm sorry to interrupt. But I need to talk to you. We talked Tuesday. I told you I'm not your daughter. I've been researching. Charles moved closer, but stayed outside her swing radius. The timing matches perfectly. Lucy disappeared on November 3, 2009. You would have been 8 years old. Keisha finally stopped swinging and turned to face him. Charles looked terrible. Pale, unshaven, his expensive clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. Dark circles under his eyes suggested He hadn't been sleeping much. "You need to stop this," she said firmly. "I can't." Charles pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. "This is Lucy at age 7. Tell me you don't see the resemblance." Despite herself, Keisha looked at the screen. The image showed a young girl with auburn curls and bright green eyes, smiling at the camera. The bone structure was indeed similar. Same nose shape, same chin, same small ears. But lots of people shared similar features. It didn't mean anything. "Kids' faces change," Keisha said. "People grow up looking different than baby pictures. Not bone structure. Not the basic architecture of the face." Charles's voice carried the desperate certainty of someone who needed to be right. "I've studied facial recognition software. The probability of this being coincidence is less than 1%. Keisha stared at him. "You've been studying facial recognition software?" "I hired a consultant. Someone who works with law enforcement on missing persons cases." Charles scrolled to another image on his phone. "Look at this comparative analysis." The screen showed 2 photos side by side, the childhood picture of Lucy and a screenshot that looked like it had been taken from construction site security footage. Keisha realized with shock that the second image was her, captured while she worked. "You've been photographing me without permission?" "The security cameras." "Delete it." Keisha's voice went dangerously quiet. "Delete that right now." "Keisha, please look at the analysis." "I said delete it." She raised the sledgehammer, not threatening him but making it clear this conversation was over. Charles quickly put away his phone. "I'm not trying to violate your privacy. I'm trying to understand how you can look so much like my daughter. Maybe because people sometimes look like other people. It happens. Not like this." Charles stepped closer, his eyes bright with obsession. "The scar above your lip. Lucy had the exact same scar from a bicycle accident. The way your left eye is slightly smaller than your right. The shape of your fingernails. These aren't coincidences." Keisha touched the small scar unconsciously, then jerked her hand away. "I fell when I was 6. Cut my lip on a broken bottle. Or maybe you fell off a bicycle and your adoptive parents told you it was a bottle to hide your real history." The suggestion hit Keisha like a slap. "My foster parents didn't lie to me about scars. They barely talked to me at all." "Foster parents?" Charles's eyes widened. "You were in foster care?" Keisha realized her mistake immediately. She'd given him more information, another piece for his obsessive puzzle. "It doesn't matter what kind of care I was in. I'm not your daughter." "But what if you are?" Charles's voice cracked with emotion. "What if, after 15 years, I've finally found her? What if you're Lucy? Then I'd remember being someone else." Keisha shouted. "I'd remember having a different name, different parents, a different life." Memory can be complicated with trauma. "Stop." Keisha held up her hand. "Just stop. I know who I am. I know my history. And I'm telling you for the last time, I am not your missing daughter." Charles stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions. Hope, desperation, something that looked like grief. "Would you take a DNA test?" he asked quietly. "Absolutely not. I'll pay you $50,000 just for the test." The number hung in the air between them like a temptation. $50,000 was more money than Keisha made in 2 years. It could change her life, give her options she'd never dreamed of. But it would also validate his obsession, encourage this dangerous fantasy that she could be someone else. "I don't want your money," she said. $100,000. Keisha felt her resolve waver for just a moment. With that much money, she could go back to school, maybe study architecture like she'd always dreamed. She could stop swinging hammers and start designing buildings. Then she looked at Charles's desperate face and felt sick. "Money can't buy you a daughter," she said quietly. "And throwing cash at me won't make me into someone I'm not." Charles's expression crumpled. For a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a broken man who'd lost the most important thing in his world and was grasping at impossible hopes. "Please," he whispered. "Just the test." If it's negative, I'll leave you alone forever. If it's positive, then what? You think I'll just forget my entire life and become your lost little girl? Keisha shook her head. I'm 23 years old. I've been taking care of myself since I was 18. I don't need a daddy, especially one who's looking for a ghost. The words were cruel, but they needed to be said. Charles was living in a fantasy, and someone had to drag him back to reality. Charles stood there for a moment, looking lost and smaller than his expensive clothes suggested. Then he nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. But if you change your mind. He pulled out a business card and set it on a nearby stack of lumber. Then he walked away without another word. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Keisha watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and something else she couldn't name. Guilt, maybe. Or pity for a man who'd been looking for his daughter so long he was seeing her in strangers. She picked up the business card. Heavy paper, embossed lettering. Charles Whitman, CEO, Whitman Industries. On the back, he'd written a phone number in careful script. Keisha tore the card in half and dropped the pieces in a nearby dumpster. Then she picked up her sledgehammer and went back to work, trying to pound away the image of Charles Whitman's desperate eyes and the nagging voice in her head that whispered, "What if he's right?" The ceiling came down without warning. Keisha was working alone in the old factory's basement storage room, breaking up concrete support pillars that were scheduled for removal. The demolition crew had cleared the upper floors hours ago, but she'd volunteered to finish the basement work. Overtime pay meant extra money, and staying busy kept her mind off Charles Whitman's desperate eyes. She'd been swinging her sledgehammer at a particularly stubborn section of concrete when she heard the groaning sound above her head. Metal stress would splintering, something fundamental giving way. Keisha looked up just as 20 feet of ceiling collapsed in a thunderous crash that filled the air with dust and debris. When the noise stopped, she found herself trapped in a pocket of space no bigger than a walk-in closet. Concrete slabs had fallen at angles, creating a cave-like shelter that had probably saved her life. But the entrance was completely blocked, and she could hear more groaning overhead as the compromised structure settled into its new configuration. "Help!" Keisha shouted, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Somebody help me." She pulled out her phone. No signal in the basement, and definitely none now with tons of debris between her and the surface. The small LED flashlight she kept on her keychain provided just enough light to see that her situation was bad. Very bad. The air already felt thick and stale. The concrete slabs that protected her from being crushed also cut off most ventilation. And worse, she could see water dripping through cracks in the debris. A ruptured pipe somewhere above was slowly flooding her tiny sanctuary. Don't panic. Keisha forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. Panic consumed oxygen, and oxygen was already going to be a problem. The crew would notice she was missing eventually. Tommy always did a head count before leaving the site. But that might be hours away, and she wasn't sure she had hours. Water continued dripping through the cracks, pooling around her boots. At this rate, her small space would be flooded within an hour or two. Should have taken the DNA test. The thought appeared unbidden, and Keisha immediately pushed it away. This wasn't the time for regrets or what-ifs. This was the time for survival. She started examining the debris pile, looking for any weak points or small openings she might be able to expand. The concrete slabs were massive, probably weighing several tons each. But maybe there was a gap she could widen, a route to the surface she couldn't see from this angle. That's when she heard voices above. "Keisha! Keisha, where are you?" "Tommy! Thank God! Down here!" she shouted as loud as she could. "I'm trapped in the basement." The voices grew louder, more urgent. She could hear heavy footsteps running across the floor above, people calling her name. But the debris muffled everything, making it hard to judge how close they were. "Can you hear me?" Tommy's voice seemed to come from directly overhead. "Yes. I'm trapped under the collapsed ceiling." "Are you hurt?" Keisha did a quick inventory. Bruised, shaken, covered in dust, but nothing broken. "I'm okay. But there's water coming in. We're going to get you out. Don't move anything, The whole structure is unstable. Don't move anything. As if she had any choice. The slabs around her were far too heavy to shift without heavy machinery. For the next 20 minutes, Keisha listened to increasingly frantic activity above. Footsteps shouted orders, the sound of equipment being moved. But the voices seemed to be getting farther away rather than closer. Then she heard a new voice, one that made her stomach clench. Where exactly is she trapped? Charles Whitman. Of course he's here. Best we can tell, she's under the northeast corner collapse, Tommy was saying. But the whole basement ceiling is compromised. We can't just start digging without bringing down more debris. What about heavy equipment? Cranes. Already called. But it'll take at least 2 hours to get the right machinery here, and we're not sure the ground can support it after the collapse. Keisha closed her eyes and leaned against the concrete wall behind her. The water was now ankle-deep around her boots, and the air was definitely getting thinner. 2 hours might be too long. Keisha. Charles's voice, closer now. Can you hear me? She almost didn't answer. The last thing she wanted was to be rescued by the man she'd been trying to avoid. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. I can hear you. How much water is down there? Keisha looked down at her submerged boots. Maybe 6 inches and rising. A pause. Then Charles's voice again, but directed away from her. How fast is that pipe leaking? Pretty fast, Tommy replied. City engineer says it's a main water line. They're trying to shut it off, but these old buildings could take a while. More frantic discussion above. Keisha caught fragments. Structural engineers, rescue protocols, liability concerns. All very professional and thorough and probably too slow to save her life. The water was now halfway up her calves. Keisha. Charles again. I'm coming down. No. Tommy's voice, sharp with alarm. Charles, you can't. The whole area is unstable. She's going to drown if we wait for heavy equipment. And you'll both be dead if more ceiling comes down. Keisha found herself oddly touched that Charles would risk his life for her, even if she wasn't his daughter. But Tommy was right. Sending another person into the unstable basement would just create 2 victims instead of 1. Don't come down here, she shouted. It's too dangerous. But she could already hear movement above, the sound of someone crawling across debris despite all reasonable objections. Charles, damn it. Tommy's voice was fading as he presumably followed. This is insane. For several minutes, Keisha heard scraping sounds, the careful displacement of smaller pieces of debris. Someone was indeed trying to reach her, moving slowly to avoid triggering another collapse. The water reached her knees. I can see light. Charles's voice, much closer now. There's a gap in the debris about 15 feet from you. Keisha looked around her confined space but couldn't see any light except from her keychain flashlight. Where? To your right, near the floor level. It's small, but maybe big enough for a person. Keisha got down on her hands and knees, feeling through the dark water for any opening she might have missed. Her fingers found a narrow gap between 2 concrete slabs, maybe 18 inches wide and a foot tall. Definitely not big enough for a person. I found it. But it's too small. We're going to widen it. Stand back. The sound of sledgehammer blows echoed through the debris pile. Charles was attacking the gap from the other side, trying to chip away enough concrete to create a passage. Be careful. Keisha shouted. You could bring down more ceiling. Better than letting you drown. Strike. The gap widened slightly. Strike. A chunk of concrete fell away. Strike. The opening was now maybe 2 feet wide. The water reached Keisha's thighs. It's still too small, she called out. Keep trying. Charles's breathing was labored from the physical exertion and probably thin air. We're almost there. More hammer blows. The gap slowly expanded, but so did the water level. Keisha was now waist deep, and her small air pocket was getting smaller as the water rose. Charles. Tommy's voice from somewhere above. The whole section is starting to shift. You need to get out of there. Not without her. Strike. 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 The gap was now large enough that Keisha could see faint light from the other side. And more importantly, she could see Charles's face through the opening. Dirty, desperate, completely focused on reaching her. "Can you fit through?" he asked. Keisha measured the opening with her eyes. Maybe if she went feet first and squeezed tight. But the water was now chest deep, which meant she'd have to hold her breath and swim through underwater. "I think so. But the water." "I know. You'll have to go under." Charles's voice was steady despite the impossible situation. "I'll be right here to pull you through." The water reached her shoulders. "Keisha, you have to go now." Charles reached through the gap, his hand extended toward her. She took a deep breath and ducked under the murky water, feeling for the opening with her feet. The concrete edges scraped against her back as she squeezed through the narrow passage, Charles's hand gripping her ankle to guide her. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might get stuck halfway through. The opening was barely wide enough, and her tool belt caught on something. But Charles pulled harder, and she popped through like a cork from a bottle. She emerged gasping in another small air pocket on the other side of the debris pile. This space was slightly larger than her original prison, and more importantly, it wasn't flooding. "You okay?" Charles was breathing hard, his expensive clothes torn and filthy. Keisha nodded, still catching her breath. "Thank you." They looked at each other in the dim light from Charles's phone flashlight. Two people from completely different worlds, trapped together in a concrete cave because sometimes life forced connections you never expected. "The rescue crew will get us out," Charles said. "Tommy knows where we are now." "Yeah." Keisha wiped muddy water from her face. "Probably take a while though." "Probably." They sat in silence for a moment, both processing what had just happened. Charles had risked his life to save her. Keisha had let him. The simple fact of being alive created a strange intimacy between them. "Why did you come down here?" Keisha asked quietly. Charles was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because I couldn't lose you again." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. "I'm not her," Keisha said gently. "I know." Charles leaned back against the concrete wall. "But what if you are?" The rescue sounds above had quieted to an occasional scrape of machinery and muffled voices. Charles and Keisha sat in their concrete prison, separated by 3 feet of space that felt both intimate and infinite. "Tell me about her," Keisha said quietly. "About Lucy." Charles looked surprised. In all their encounters, she'd never asked for details about his missing daughter. "Why?" "Because we might die down here." Keisha's voice was matter-of-fact. "And because you saved my life. I figure I owe you that much." Charles was quiet for a long moment, his phone's flashlight casting strange shadows on the debris around them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried 15 years of pain. "She was stubborn." God, was she stubborn? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She'd argue with me about everything. Bedtime, homework, what to wear to school. Drove me crazy. Sounds like a normal kid." "She was extraordinary." Charles's eyes grew distant. Lucy could build these incredible structures with Legos, not just following the instructions, but designing her own buildings. She wanted to be an architect, said she was going to design skyscrapers that looked like castles. Keisha felt an unexpected stab of recognition. She'd always loved building things, had dreamed of architecture before life forced her into construction work instead. What happened the night she disappeared? Charles's expression darkened. "We had a fight. A stupid, pointless fight about her grades. She'd gotten a C in math, and I lost my temper. Told her she'd never amount to anything if she didn't apply herself. You were just being a parent. I was being an ass." Charles's voice turned harsh. "Lucy was 13 years old, and I was treating her like a failed business investment. She ran to her room crying, and I—" He stopped, his throat working. "What?" "I went to my office. Had conference calls with Tokyo. Didn't even say goodnight." Charles pressed his palms against his eyes. "She was gone when I woke up. Window open. Bed empty. Just gone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with guilt and regret. The police thought she ran away, Charles continued. Said most missing kids come home within 48 hours. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months. No trace of her anywhere. What about your wife? Ex-wife. Patricia blamed me, and she was right to. If I hadn't been so hard on Lucy, if I'd talked to her instead of yelling. Charles shook his head. The marriage didn't survive. How could it? Every time Patricia looked at me, she saw the man who drove our daughter away. Keisha studied his profile in the dim light. The guilt was carved into his features like lines in stone. You think Lucy ran away because of one fight? I think Lucy ran away because I was a terrible father who cared more about business than his daughter. Charles's voice broke slightly. And I think something happened to her out there because I wasn't the kind of man she felt safe coming home to. The raw pain in his confession made Keisha's chest ache. She'd spent 2 days resenting this man's intrusion into her life, but sitting here in the dark, she could see the broken father underneath the billionaire facade. That's why you started the foundation, she said. For missing children. Charles nodded. $12 million raised last year. Helped reunite 43 families. But Lucy's still gone, and I'm still the man who failed her. Above them, machinery rumbled as the rescue operation continued. But down in their concrete cave, the world had shrunk to 2 people sharing painful truths. Can I tell you something? Keisha asked. Of course. I used to build things too. Not Legos, but whatever I could find. Cardboard boxes, wooden scraps, anything. She picked at a loose thread on her work gloves. Foster families don't usually invest in construction toys for temporary kids. How many families? 7. Between ages 2 and 18. Keisha's voice was steady, but Charles could hear the old hurt underneath. Some were better than others. The Garcias kept me for 3 years. That was the longest. They were good people, just too old to handle a teenager. What about your birth parents? Died when I was 2. House fire on the east side. Keisha's matter-of-fact tone didn't hide the weight of that loss. Social worker said they tried to save me but got trapped. I was the only survivor. Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. House fire. Yeah. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Something about that detail bothered him, but he couldn't place why. The adoption records, Charles said carefully. You said they were sealed. Standard procedure for kids who age out of the system. Protects everyone's privacy. Keisha shrugged. I never tried to open them. Figured if my birth parents had wanted me to find them, they wouldn't have given me up. But they didn't give you up. They died. Yeah, but... Keisha paused, considering. I guess I always assumed there must have been relatives who chose not to take me. Otherwise, why would I end up in foster care? Charles felt that cold feeling spread through his chest. Lucy had disappeared in November 2009. Keisha said her birth parents died when she was 2, which would have been around 2003 if she was really 23 now. But what if she wasn't 23? What if trauma and instability had made it hard to keep track of exact dates? What if the social workers had gotten something wrong? Keisha, Charles said slowly. What if I told you I could help you open those adoption records? Why would you want to do that? Because maybe they contain answers we both need. Keisha studied his face in the dim light. You still think I'm her, don't you? I think there are too many coincidences to ignore. Charles leaned forward slightly. The resemblance, the timing, your love of building things. Even the scar on your lip. Lots of kids fall and cut themselves. From bicycle accidents. Keisha went very still. What? You said you cut your lip on a broken bottle when you were 6. But what if it was actually a bicycle accident when you were 7? What if the foster family that took you in after the trauma told you a different story to help you cope? That's... Keisha started to object, then stopped. Something was stirring in the back of her mind, a half-remembered image she'd always assumed was a dream. A pink bicycle with streamers on the handlebars. Flying down a hill, wind in her hair, feeling free. Then falling, the taste of blood, someone screaming her name. But who had been screaming? And what name had they used? I need to see those records, Charles said urgently. With my resources, I can get them opened within days. DNA test results take longer, but adoption records. Stop. Keisha held up her hand. Just stop. But Charles couldn't stop. The possibility was consuming him. The hope he'd been carrying for 15 years finally finding a target. What if your name wasn't always Keisha? What if the social workers gave you a new identity to help you start fresh after trauma? It happens more often than people think, especially with young children who've experienced. I said stop. Keisha's voice echoed off the concrete walls. The silence that followed was deafening. I remember my name, Keisha said quietly. I've always been Keisha Johnson. Since I was old enough to talk. Memory can be unreliable. Yeah, you mentioned that. Keisha's tone was getting dangerous again. But you know what I remember clearly? Being told my birth parents died in a fire. Being moved from home to home. Learning not to get attached because everyone leaves eventually. But what if? What if what? Keisha turned to face him fully. What if I'm your missing daughter who somehow lost her memory and got placed with a fake identity? What if my entire life story is a lie? What if everything I know about myself is wrong? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Would that be so terrible? Charles asked quietly. Yes. The word exploded from Keisha with surprising force. Because then I wouldn't know who I am anymore. I wouldn't know where I came from or what's real or who I can trust. You could trust me. Could I? Keisha's eyes blazed in the dim light. You're asking me to believe that my whole life has been built on lies. That's not trust, Charles. That's faith. And I don't have faith in people who abandon their children. The words hit Charles like physical blows. I didn't abandon Lucy. She ran away. Because you made her feel like she had to. They stared at each other across the small space, both breathing hard. The truth hung between them, ugly, complicated, and unavoidable. I was a terrible father, Charles said finally. But I loved her. I love her. If there's even a chance you're Lucy, then I need to know. Because I've spent 15 years wondering if she's alive, if she's safe, if she forgives me. And maybe that's selfish, but I can't stop wondering. Keisha's anger seemed to deflate slightly. And what if the DNA test comes back negative? What if I'm just some random woman who happens to look like your daughter? Then I'll know. And I'll let you go. Promise. Charles met her eyes. I promise. Above them, the sound of machinery grew closer. Voices became more distinct. Their rescue was imminent, which meant this moment of forced intimacy was almost over. The adoption records, Keisha said quietly. If I agree to let you help open them, what happens to the information? Whatever you want. If they prove you're not Lucy, I destroy everything and never contact you again. If they prove you are. Charles's voice caught. Then we figure out what that means together. Keisha closed her eyes and leaned back against the concrete wall. Somewhere above them, Tommy was probably coordinating the final stage of their rescue. Soon they'd be back in the real world where she was a construction worker and he was a billionaire, and this impossible conversation would seem like a fever dream. But right now, in this moment, she was just a young woman who'd never known her real history, and he was just a father who'd lost his child. Okay, she said without opening her eyes. Okay. Open the records. Run your DNA test. Find out once and for all if I'm your Lucy. Keisha opened her eyes and looked directly at him. But Charles. Yeah. When it comes back negative, I want you to get help. Real help. From a therapist or grief counselor or someone who can help you process losing your daughter without seeing her in every young woman who crosses your path. Charles nodded slowly. And if it comes back positive? Keisha was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sounds of their impending rescue. Then we'll figure out how a missing white girl became a black construction worker with no memory of her previous life. A shaft of sunlight suddenly pierced their concrete cave as rescue workers broke through the debris above them. There they are. Tommy's voice, closer than it had been in over an hour. As hands reached down to pull them to safety, Charles and Keisha exchanged one last look in the dim light of their shared prison. Both knew their lives were about to change forever. The only question was how. Keisha had never been inside a lawyer's office that cost more per hour than she made in a month. But Charles Whitman's attorney apparently charged enough to afford mahogany furniture and windows overlooking the Detroit River. She sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, watching Charles pace behind the massive desk while his lawyer, Robert Hartwell, made phone calls to various government agencies. The adoption records should be unsealed by tomorrow afternoon, Robert was saying into his phone. Yes, I understand the usual timeline. No, this can't wait the standard 30 days. Charles had called her the morning after their rescue with a simple message. The DNA test is scheduled for this afternoon. The adoption records will take 48 hours. Are you ready? She hadn't been ready. She wasn't sure anyone could be ready to discover their entire life might be a lie. But she'd agreed to meet him anyway, partly out of curiosity and partly because she owed him her life. DNA results will be available by Friday, Charles said, finally stopping his pacing. 2 more days. And then we'll know. Keisha's voice was steadier than she felt. And then we'll know. They'd been doing this dance for 3 days. Polite conversation layered over seismic anticipation. Charles had taken time off work, claiming he couldn't concentrate on quarterly reports while waiting for news that might reunite him with his daughter. Keisha had used sick days, telling Tommy she was still shaken up from the accident. Both were lying. The truth was they couldn't stay away from each other. Mr. Whitman. Robert hung up his phone. The social services contact says the adoption files are more complex than usual. Something about multiple placements and emergency custody transfers. Charles and Keisha exchanged glances. Multiple placements sounded like a child who'd been moved around the system, not a simple adoption after parents died in a fire. What does that mean exactly? Keisha asked. It means your early childhood was complicated, Robert said diplomatically. We should have more details tomorrow. After they left the lawyer's office, Charles surprised Keisha by asking if she wanted to get coffee instead of going their separate ways. I know a place, he said. Nothing fancy. Just good coffee. The place turned out to be a small cafe in Corktown, the kind of neighborhood spot where construction workers grabbed breakfast before job sites. Charles looked wildly out of place in his expensive suit, but he ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin like he'd been coming there for years. This was Lucy's favorite place, he said when they found a table near the window. I used to bring her here Saturday mornings before her architecture camp. Architecture camp? Keisha felt that familiar stab of recognition. Summer program at Lawrence Tech. She was the youngest kid they'd ever accepted. Charles smiled at the memory. 8 weeks of designing buildings and learning about structural engineering. She lived for those Saturdays. Keisha stirred sugar into her coffee, thinking about her own childhood dreams of designing buildings. She'd spent hours in the Detroit Public Library looking at architecture books, sketching her own designs in notebook margins. What was she like? Besides stubborn. Charles's expression softened. Funny. She had this laugh that was way too big for her body. And she was brave, never backed down from a challenge, even when she probably should have. He paused. She would have liked you. How can you be so sure? Because she would have admired your independence. Lucy hated being taken care of. Always insisted on doing everything herself. Keisha felt an uncomfortable flutter in her chest. She'd been insisting on independence since she was old enough to tie her own shoes. Tell me about foster care, Charles said quietly. What was it like? The question caught Keisha off guard. Most people avoided asking about her childhood, uncomfortable with stories that didn't have happy endings. Lonely, she said after a moment. Even in good homes, you're always temporary. People try to care about you, but there's this understanding that you might leave any time. Makes it hard to get attached. Is that why you work construction instead of architecture? Keisha looked up sharply. How did you? You mentioned sketching buildings in the library. And the way you look at construction sites, like you're seeing the finished product instead of just demolition work. Charles leaned forward slightly. You're not just tearing things down. You're imagining what could be built. The observation was so accurate it made Keisha's chest tight. Architecture school costs money I don't have. Construction pays the bills. What if money wasn't an issue? It's always an issue for people like me. But what if it wasn't? Charles pressed gently. What would you build? Keisha was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the neighborhood around them. Corktown was gentrifying rapidly. Old warehouses being converted to luxury lofts that working-class families couldn't afford. Housing, she said finally. Real housing for people who actually live here. Not luxury condos for people who want to play urban pioneer. She turned back to Charles. I'd design buildings that serve communities instead of displacing them. Charles nodded thoughtfully. Lucy wanted to design affordable housing too. Said architecture should be about helping people, not just making money. Another uncomfortable flutter. Keisha pushed it away. What about you? She asked. What did you want to be before you became a billionaire? Charles laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I wanted to be a father. Sounds simple, but it was the only thing I ever really wanted. When Patricia got pregnant, I thought I had it figured out. His expression darkened. Turns out wanting something and being good at it are very different things. You might get another chance. The words slipped out before Keisha could stop them. Charles went very still. If the test comes back positive, she clarified quickly. If I'm really Lucy, you'd get another chance to be a father. Would I? Charles's voice was careful. You're 23 years old. You've been taking care of yourself for years. What would I be to you except a stranger who shares your DNA? It was a fair question, and Keisha didn't have a good answer. The idea of suddenly having a father, especially a wealthy white father, felt surreal and complicated. I don't know, she said honestly. But maybe we could figure it out together. Something shifted in Charles's expression. Hope, maybe, or relief that she wasn't rejecting the possibility entirely. There's something I want to show you, he said. If you're willing. An hour later, they were standing in the study of Charles's Bloomfield Hills mansion, surrounded by 15 years of searching for his missing daughter. The room was a shrine to Lucy Whitman. Photos covered every wall, school pictures, vacation snapshots, candid shots of a girl growing from toddler to teenager. A desk held neat stacks of police reports, private investigator summaries, and leads that had gone nowhere. But what caught Keisha's attention was the corner where Lucy's Lego buildings were displayed like museum pieces. Dozens of structures, from simple houses to elaborate skyscrapers, each one more complex than the last. She built all of these? Keisha approached the display carefully. Every one. I couldn't bring myself to put them away after she disappeared. Charles picked up a particularly intricate castle. This was her last project. She spent 3 weeks on it, working every day after school. Keisha studied the castle's design, the clever use of different colored blocks to create patterns, the way the towers were engineered to support the main structure, the tiny details that brought the whole thing to life. She was talented. She was brilliant. Charles set the castle back carefully. The architectural camp instructor said she had a natural understanding of space and structure that you couldn't teach. Keisha moved along the display, examining each building. There was something familiar about Lucy's style, the way she used symmetry, the attention to functional details, the bold color choices that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. This one, Keisha pointed to a modernist apartment building. I sketched something just like this when I was 15. Same basic design, same window pattern. Charles joined her at the display case. Lucy built that when she was 12. They stood side by side, looking at a Lego building that somehow connected them across 15 years and an impossible gulf of circumstances. Charles, Keisha said quietly, what if the test comes back negative? What if all these similarities are just coincidence? Then I'll have spent 3 days getting to know an extraordinary young woman who reminds me why I wanted to be a father in the first place." The honesty in his voice made Keisha's throat tight. When she looked at him, she saw past the expensive clothes and billionaire lifestyle to the man underneath. Someone who'd been carrying grief for 15 years and was finally allowing himself to hope again. "And if it comes back positive?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the photos of his missing daughter. "Then I'll try to be the father Lucy deserved to have, even if she doesn't remember being Lucy anymore." That night, Keisha lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling and thinking about Lego castles and coffee shop conversations and a man who'd built a shrine to his missing daughter. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong to someone, to have a history that stretched back before foster homes and social workers, to be someone's daughter instead of just someone's temporary responsibility. What if I really am Lucy Whitman? The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The DNA results arrived by courier while Charles was making coffee in his kitchen, but it was the phone call from his private investigator that destroyed his world. "Charles, we need to talk." Marcus Webb's voice was grim. "Not over the phone. Can you come to my office? Just tell me. Is she Lucy? It's complicated. Come in person. And Charles, bring Keisha with you." An hour later, Charles and Keisha sat across from Marcus Webb in his downtown office. The DNA results lay unopened on the desk between them like a loaded weapon. Marcus was a former Detroit police detective who'd spent the last 8 years working missing persons cases for families wealthy enough to afford private investigations. Charles had hired him 3 months after Lucy disappeared, and Marcus had been searching ever since. "Before we discuss the DNA results," Marcus said carefully, "there's something else you both need to know. About Lucy. About what really happened." Charles felt ice form in his stomach. "What do you mean, what really happened?" "Lucy ran away." "No, Charles. She didn't." The words hit like a physical blow. Keisha reached out instinctively and grabbed Charles's hand as his face went white. "That's impossible," the police said. "The police were wrong. And I was wrong. And you were wrong." Marcus pulled out a thick file. "I found Lucy 2 weeks ago." The silence in the room was deafening. "Found her?" Charles's voice was barely audible. "Her remains. In the basement of an abandoned house on 8 Mile Road. She's been there for 15 years. Charles made a sound like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Keisha's grip on his hand tightened as he swayed in his chair. "How?" Charles whispered. "She was murdered the night she disappeared. Strangled by someone who knew she'd be walking home alone." Marcus's voice was clinical, but his eyes were kind. "She never ran away, Charles. Someone took her from the street 3 blocks from your house." Charles bent forward like he was going to be sick. 15 years of hope, 15 years of believing Lucy was alive somewhere, maybe thinking about coming home. All of it lies. "Why didn't you tell me you'd found her?" Charles's voice cracked. "Because I wanted to catch the bastard who killed her first. And because—" Marcus hesitated. "Because of what else I discovered while investigating her death." He pulled out another file, this one even thicker. The man who murdered Lucy was named Eugene Patterson. Small-time predator with a history of targeting teenage girls. He died in prison 6 years ago, serving time for another assault. "Good," Charles said savagely. "Patterson lived in a boarding house on the east side. Paid rent in cash. No permanent address. But I traced his movements the week before Lucy's murder, and something interesting turned up." Marcus spread photos across the desk, surveillance images, building records, financial documents. Patterson had been hired for day labor at a demolition site. A Whitman Industries project. He was working there the day before Lucy disappeared. Charles looked up sharply. "What? Your company was tearing down old housing projects to build luxury condos." Patterson was part of the crew. He would have overheard workers talking about their boss, about where Charles Whitman lived, about his family. The implications hit Charles like a sledgehammer. "You're saying Lucy was targeted because of me?" Because someone at my job site. I'm saying Lucy died because your wealth made your family visible. Patterson chose her specifically because he knew you had money, knew you lived in Bloomfield Hills, knew you had a teenage daughter. Charles was shaking now, his entire body trembling with the weight of this revelation. Not only was Lucy dead, but she died because of his success, his visibility, his failure to protect her from the attention his wealth brought. There's more, Marcus said quietly. More. Keisha spoke for the first time since entering the office. How can there be more? Marcus turned to her with an expression that looked almost apologetic. The demolition site where Patterson worked. It was a housing project on the east side called Riverside Gardens. Built in the 1960s, condemned in 2009. Whitman Industries tore it down to build luxury condos. Keisha went very still. Riverside Gardens. You know it. That's where I lived. As a baby. Before my birth parents died in the fire. Her voice was flat, emotionless. The social worker said it was a house fire on the east side. Marcus nodded grimly. November 15, 2009. Marcus and Diane Johnson. They died trying to escape an electrical fire that started in their apartment building. November 15th, Charles repeated numbly. That's 12 days after Lucy disappeared. The building was scheduled for demolition the following month, Marcus continued. Whitman Industries had already purchased the property and relocated most of the tenants. But a few families remained, people who couldn't afford to move or had nowhere else to go. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The electrical fire, Keisha said slowly. Was it really an accident? Marcus pulled out building inspection reports. The wiring in Riverside Gardens had been deteriorating for years. Your company knew about the electrical problems when you bought the property, Charles. The inspection reports document extensive fire hazards. Charles felt the room spinning around him. We provided relocation assistance. Every tenant received money to move. Most did. But the Johnson family couldn't find anywhere else they could afford with a 2-year-old daughter. They stayed because they had no choice. Keisha stood up abruptly, moving away from the desk. You're telling me that Charles's company bought the building where my parents lived, knew it was a fire hazard, and did nothing to fix it before people died? The building was condemned. It was scheduled for demolition. From a legal standpoint, Whitman Industries had no obligation to maintain electrical systems in a structure they were going to tear down. Legal standpoint, Keisha repeated. What about moral standpoint? Marcus looked between Charles and Keisha, seeing the devastation on both their faces. There's one more thing. The DNA results. He opened the envelope they'd all forgotten about in the wake of more devastating revelations. Keisha, you are not Lucy Whitman. No genetic relationship whatsoever. The negative results should have been anticlimactic after everything else they'd learned. Instead, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of their impossible hope. So that's it, Keisha said quietly. I'm not your daughter. I'm just the orphan your company created when you let my parents burn to death in a building you knew was dangerous. Keisha, I didn't know. Didn't you? She turned on him with blazing eyes. You owned the building. You had the inspection reports. You knew families were still living there. We offered relocation money. How much? Enough for a security deposit and first month's rent? Enough to actually move a family with a toddler. Keisha's voice was rising. Or just enough to make yourselves feel better about displacing poor people for luxury condos? Charles couldn't answer because he didn't know. He'd signed the acquisition papers and moved on to the next deal. He'd never followed up on individual families, never wondered what happened to people who couldn't afford to relocate. My parents died because you valued profit over people, Keisha continued. And your daughter died because your wealth made you a target. We're both victims of the same thing, your money and the attention it brings. The parallel was devastating and undeniable. Charles's success had killed both Lucy and Keisha's parents, creating two different kinds of orphans who'd found each other 15 years later. I spent 3 days thinking you might be my father, Keisha said, her voice breaking. I let myself imagine having a family, belonging somewhere. But you're not my father. You're the man whose company killed my real parents." She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at Charles one final time. "I hope you get the help you need to process losing Lucy. I really do. But I can't be part of that healing. Not when your family's wealth is what destroyed mine. Keisha, please. Don't." She held up her hand. "Don't follow me, don't call me, don't send me money to make yourself feel better. We're done." The door closed behind her with a quiet click that sounded like the end of the world. Charles sat in the silence that followed, staring at the DNA results that confirmed what he'd already known in his heart. He'd lost his daughter twice. Once when she was murdered, and again when he'd found someone who could have filled that void but was destroyed by the same wealth that had cost Lucy her life. Marcus cleared his throat carefully. "Charles, there's going to be a memorial service for Lucy. Now that we've found her, you can finally lay her to rest." Charles nodded without really hearing. All he could think about was the look in Keisha's eyes when she realized his money had killed her parents. The same money he'd offered her to take a DNA test. The same money that had made Lucy a target for a predator. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, was soaked in blood. "Charles." Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" But Charles couldn't answer. Because for the first time in 15 years, he knew exactly what had happened to his daughter. And the truth was so much worse than any uncertainty he'd lived with before. Lucy was dead. Keisha's parents were dead. And he was the common thread connecting both tragedies. Some things couldn't be fixed with money. Some wounds couldn't be healed with wealth. Some mistakes destroyed everything you touched, even the people you tried to save. Charles had been sitting in his study for 48 hours, staring at Lucy's Lego buildings and wondering if the world would be better off without him in it. The whiskey bottle on his desk was half empty. He couldn't remember when he'd started drinking, but the amber liquid did nothing to numb the crushing weight of what he'd learned. If anything, it made the guilt sharper, more precise. Lucy was murdered because of me. Keisha's parents died because of me. Everything I touch turns to ash. The memorial service for Lucy was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Patricia had flown in from California, and they'd managed a civil conversation about burial arrangements without once mentioning that their daughter had been dead for 15 years while they'd held onto hope. Some truths were too big for words. Charles picked up his phone for the 100th time, scrolling to Keisha's number. He'd called twice in the past 2 days, but she hadn't answered. He'd driven to her apartment, but she wasn't there. He'd gone to the construction site, but Tommy said she'd quit without giving notice. She'd vanished from his life as completely as Lucy had 15 years ago. The difference was, he knew exactly why Keisha had left. And he knew she was right to go. "You're the man whose company killed my real parents." The words echoed in his head like a judgment. Charles had built his fortune on real estate development, buying distressed properties and transforming them into profitable ventures. He'd told himself he was revitalizing neighborhoods, creating jobs, improving communities. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He'd gotten rich by displacing poor people who had nowhere else to go. Charles stood up unsteadily and walked to the window overlooking his manicured grounds. 30 acres of pristine landscaping that cost more to maintain each month than most families made in a year. All of it purchased with money that was stained with blood. His phone rang. "Patricia." "Charles, I need to ask you something." Her voice was strained but controlled. "The private investigator said Lucy was killed by someone who worked for your company?" "Yes." "And this other woman, the one you thought might be Lucy, her parents died in a building you owned?" Charles closed his eyes. "Yes." A long pause. Then, "Jesus Christ, Charles. What have you done?" "I don't know." The admission came out as a whisper. "I thought I was building something good. But everything I've touched has turned to poison." Patricia's voice was flat. "Our daughter is dead because you made us targets. Other people are dead because you valued money over safety. How do you live with yourself?" It was a fair question. How did he live with himself? Charles looked around his study, at the shrine to Lucy, at the photos of a girl who died because her father was too successful, too visible, too careless about the enemies his wealth might create. "I don't think I can," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" Charles didn't answer. He hung up the phone and walked to his desk where he kept a small pistol in the locked drawer. The same gun he'd bought after Lucy disappeared, when he was afraid the kidnapper might come back for Patricia. He'd never used it. Never even loaded it. But tonight it might solve everyone's problems. The gun felt heavier than expected in his hands. Charles had never contemplated suicide seriously before, but sitting in the wreckage of his life, it seemed like the only honest response to what he'd done. Lucy was dead because of him. Keisha's parents were dead because of him. How many other people had suffered so he could build his empire? At least Keisha could inherit everything. Make better use of the money than I ever did. But even as the thought formed, Charles knew it was another act of cowardice. Leaving money to Keisha wouldn't bring back her parents any more than killing himself would bring back Lucy. The memorial service was tomorrow. Patricia would be there, Lucy's teachers from architecture camp, friends who'd never stopped hoping she'd come home. What would Lucy think if she knew her father killed himself instead of facing what he'd done? Charles set the gun down and picked up one of Lucy's Lego buildings, the castle she'd been working on the night she disappeared. The structure was impossibly complex for a 13-year-old, full of architectural details that showed real understanding of engineering principles. Lucy had wanted to design buildings that helped people. Affordable housing, community centers, structures that served neighborhoods instead of displacing them. What if I did that instead? The thought came from nowhere, cutting through the fog of self-pity and whiskey. What if, instead of ending everything, he used what he'd learned to honor both Lucy and Keisha's parents? Charles pulled out his laptop and started typing, his fingers moving faster than they had in months. He drafted a proposal for the Whitman Foundation, expanding their mission beyond missing children to include affordable housing development. Real affordable housing, not the luxury projects that drove out working families. He researched the families displaced by Riverside Gardens demolition, tracking down everyone who'd been forced to relocate when his company bought the property. 43 families, most of whom had struggled to find comparable housing they could afford. Charles made a list of names and addresses. People who deserved compensation for what his company had cost them. Not because the law required it, but because it was right. By dawn, he'd outlined a plan to spend $200 million over the next 5 years building truly affordable housing in Detroit. Not gentrification disguised as community development, but real housing for people who actually lived and worked in the neighborhoods. It wouldn't bring back Lucy or Keisha's parents, but it might prevent other families from suffering the same losses. Charles printed out the proposal and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he locked the gun away and went upstairs to shower and dress for Lucy's memorial service. Meanwhile, across town, Keisha had been staying at her friend Rosa's apartment since walking out of the private investigator's office, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Charles's face when he learned Lucy was dead. The devastation, the guilt, the way he'd seemed to shrink into himself when the truth hit. She'd spent 2 days hating him, cycling through rage and grief and a hollow feeling she couldn't name. Charles Whitman was the man whose company had killed her parents. But he was also the man who'd risked his life to save her from a collapsed ceiling. How could both things be true? Rosa had been patient with her mood swings, bringing coffee and listening to Keisha rage about billionaires who profited from poor people's suffering. But this morning, Rosa finally spoke up. "You need to go to that memorial service," she said bluntly. "What? No. Absolutely not." "Yes. Because that man lost his daughter, and you know what that feels like." Keisha stared at her friend. "I know what it feels like to lose parents because of his negligence. You also know what it feels like to grow up wondering who you really are, where you come from, if anyone in the world gives a damn about you." Rosa sat down next to her on the couch. "Charles gave a damn. He was wrong about you being his daughter, but he wasn't wrong about caring. His company killed my parents. And now he has to live with that. Just like you have to live with being an orphan." Rosa's voice softened. "I'm not saying you have to forgive him, but maybe you could understand what it feels like to lose family." Keisha picked up the newspaper from Rosa's coffee table. Lucy's memorial service was announced on the front page, a private ceremony for the Whitman family's missing daughter who'd finally been found. The photo showed Lucy at age 12, grinning at the camera with the confidence of a child who'd never imagined the world could be dangerous. She looked nothing like Keisha. DNA had confirmed what their hearts should have known from the beginning. They were strangers brought together by grief and desperate hope. But in the past week, Charles had become more than a stranger to her. He'd become the closest thing to a father she'd ever known, even if it was built on a foundation of impossible dreams. What would my real parents want me to do? Marcus and Diane Johnson had died trying to escape a fire in a building they couldn't afford to leave. From everything the social worker had told her over the years, they'd been good people who'd loved their daughter and wanted better for her. Would they want her to carry hatred for the rest of her life? Or would they want her to find a way forward that honored their memory without destroying her own future? Keisha looked at Lucy's photo again. A girl who dreamed of designing buildings that helped people, just like Keisha had always dreamed. Maybe they weren't so different after all. "Rosa," Keisha said quietly, "can you drive me somewhere?" An hour later, Keisha stood outside St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Bloomfield Hills, watching people in expensive black clothes file into the memorial service for a girl who'd been dead for 15 years. She didn't belong here. This was a world of private schools and country clubs, of people who'd never worried about security deposits or whether their electricity might get shut off. But Lucy had belonged to this world, and Lucy was gone. And somehow, in the middle of all the pain and confusion, Keisha felt like she owed it to both Lucy and Charles to bear witness to their grief. She walked up the church steps, not sure what she was going to say or do, but certain that she needed to be there. Because sometimes the hardest choice was also the right one. And sometimes forgiveness was the only thing that could stop the cycle of pain from claiming another generation. Charles saw Keisha the moment she walked into the church. She stood at the back in dark jeans and a navy sweater, clearly out of place among the congregation of business associates and family friends. But she was there. Despite everything he'd done, despite the pain his wealth had caused her family, she'd come to witness his daughter's farewell. The service had been beautiful in the way that memorial services for children always were, heartbreaking and insufficient. Patricia had read a poem Lucy wrote in 5th grade about buildings that could touch the sky. Lucy's architecture camp instructor shared stories about a girl who saw potential in empty lots and abandoned structures. Charles had spoken last, his voice breaking as he told the congregation about Lucy's dreams of designing affordable housing, about her belief that architecture should serve people instead of profits. He didn't mention that those same profits had led to her death. Some truths were too raw for public consumption. But his eyes kept finding Keisha throughout the service, drawing strength from her quiet presence in the back pew. After the final prayer, guests moved to the fellowship hall for reception. Charles found himself accepting condolences from people who'd spent 15 years hoping Lucy would come home, now adjusting to the finality of loss. "She would have been an amazing architect," said Dr. Reynolds, Lucy's favorite instructor. "That child saw possibilities everywhere she looked." She did. Charles glanced toward the back of the room where Keisha stood alone, studying photos of Lucy displayed on easels. She wanted to build homes for people who needed them. Perhaps you could establish a scholarship in her name? Help other young architects pursue that same vision. "Actually," Charles said slowly, "I have something bigger in mind." He excused himself and walked across the room to where Keisha stood before a photo of Lucy at age 10, holding up a Lego model of an apartment complex. "Thank you," Charles said quietly, "for coming." Keisha didn't look at him immediately. "I wasn't sure I should be here. You belong here more than anyone." Charles moved to stand beside her, both of them looking at Lucy's bright, hopeful face. "You're the only person who understands what she wanted to build. Affordable housing for working families." Keisha's voice was soft. "I read about it in the program." She talked about it constantly. Said architecture was about creating homes, not just buildings. Charles pulled the folded proposal from his jacket pocket. "I want to show you something." Keisha took the papers, scanning the first page with growing surprise. The Lucy Whitman Memorial Housing Initiative. $200 million over 5 years. Real affordable housing. not luxury condos disguised as community development. Charles's voice was steady despite the weight of what he was proposing. Built in partnerships with existing residents, designed to strengthen neighborhoods instead of displacing them. Keisha looked up from the proposal. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to run it. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Charles, I'm not qualified to. You have a degree in construction management from Wayne State. I checked. Charles met her eyes directly. You understand both the technical side and what these communities need. You've lived the reality of housing insecurity. That doesn't make me qualified to oversee a $200 million initiative. No, Charles agreed. But your integrity does. Your understanding of what Lucy wanted to accomplish does. Your refusal to be bought by my money does. Keisha stared at the proposal, her hands shaking slightly. This is guilt money. Yes, it is. Charles didn't try to deny it. I'm guilty of valuing profit over people. I'm guilty of not thinking about the consequences of my business decisions. I'm guilty of creating the conditions that killed both Lucy and your parents. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But guilt money spent on the right things can still build homes for families who need them. It can still honor Lucy's memory and your parents' memory. It can still prevent other children from growing up orphaned by preventable tragedies. Keisha was quiet for a long time, reading through the detailed proposal. Plans for community input, requirements for local hiring, partnerships with existing social services. It wasn't a vanity project or tax write-off. It was a genuine attempt to address systemic housing inequality. What would my role be exactly? Executive Director. You'd have full authority over site selection, design approval, community partnerships. I'd provide funding and stay out of your way. And if I refuse? Charles looked back at Lucy's photo. Then I'll find someone else to run it. But it won't be as good, and it won't honor the people we've lost the way you could. Keisha turned to face him fully. Charles, I need you to understand something. Taking this job wouldn't make us family. It wouldn't make you my father or me your daughter. We're not going to have some Hollywood ending where grief magically transforms into love. I know. I'm still angry about what happened to my parents. That anger isn't going away just because you're trying to make amends. I wouldn't expect it to. And I can't be responsible for your healing. You need to get professional help to process losing Lucy. Real therapy, not just throwing money at housing projects. Charles nodded. I've already made an appointment. Keisha studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. But all she saw was a broken man trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his mistakes. There's one more condition, she said. Anything. The first development goes on the site where Riverside Gardens used to be. Where my parents died. Keisha's voice was firm. Beautiful, affordable housing for families like mine. With their names on a memorial plaque. Charles felt tears sting his eyes. Marcus and Diane Johnson Memorial Housing Complex. And Lucy gets her name on the playground. The Lucy Whitman Community Playground, where kids can dream about building castles and skyscrapers. The image of children playing where tragedy had once reigned was almost too beautiful to bear. Charles wiped his eyes and nodded. Is that a yes? He asked quietly. Keisha looked around the fellowship hall, at people sharing memories of a girl who died too young, at photos of Lucy's architectural dreams, at a community of loss trying to find meaning in grief. It's a yes to the job, she said finally. It's a yes to honoring our families. It's a yes to building something good from something terrible. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. But Charles, this isn't forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness has to be earned through actions, not just intentions. Show me that you can follow through on this commitment. Show me that you can change how you do business. Show me that Lucy and my parents' deaths meant something. How long do I have? Keisha smiled for the first time since entering the church. The rest of your life. The groundbreaking ceremony for Marcus and Diane Johnson Memorial Housing Complex took place on a crisp autumn morning that reminded Keisha of the day she'd first met Charles Whitman. 48 affordable units would rise on the site where Riverside Gardens had once stood, designed by a team of architects that included recent graduates from Lucy's Memorial Scholarship Program. The playground equipment was already installed, bright red and yellow structures that looked like miniature castles, just as Lucy might have designed them. Charles stood with the other dignitaries as Keisha addressed the crowd of residents, city officials, and construction workers who would build the complex. "This project represents more than affordable housing," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "It represents the truth that our tragedies don't have to define our futures. That loss can lead to love. That mistakes can become the foundation for something better." She looked directly at Charles as she continued. "1 year ago, I thought I knew who I was and where I came from. I thought my story was simple. A foster kid who aged out of the system and made her own way in the world. But sometimes life forces us to reconsider our stories, to find connections we never expected, to discover that family isn't always about blood." Charles felt his throat tighten. Over the past year, they'd worked together weekly on the housing initiative. Slowly, carefully, they'd built something that wasn't quite family but wasn't just business either. Trust, maybe. Or understanding. A bond forged from shared loss and common purpose. "The families who will live here deserve more than just affordable rent," Keisha continued. "They deserve community, stability, hope. They deserve to know that their neighbors see them as human beings worthy of dignity and respect." After the ceremony, Charles and Keisha walked through the construction site together, imagining the homes that would soon fill the empty lot. "Lucy would have loved this," Charles said, watching workers pour foundation concrete. "She would have improved the design," Keisha replied with a smile. "I looked at her Lego buildings again last week. That girl understood architectural flow better than most professionals." They reached the spot where the playground stood, surrounded by small trees that would provide shade as they grew. "Charles," Keisha said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her, noting the serious expression on her face. "I forgive you." The words hit him like a physical force. After a year of earning her trust, of proving his commitment to change, of working alongside her to build something meaningful, she was finally ready to let go of the anger that had sustained her. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Keisha touched the memorial plaque that bore her parents' names. "Carrying hatred doesn't honor their memory. Building homes for families like ours does." Charles felt 15 years of guilt begin to lift from his shoulders. Not disappearing entirely. He would always carry responsibility for the consequences of his choices, but transforming into something lighter. Purpose instead of shame. Action instead of regret. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we've built housing complexes in 12 neighborhoods and helped 1,000 families find stable homes." Charles laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "Lucy definitely would have improved the design. But I think she'd be proud of what we're building. I think my parents would be too." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from their shared grief. "Charles," Keisha said as they prepared to leave. "Yeah. For what it's worth, you would have been a good father. To Lucy, I mean. If circumstances had been different." The words were a gift he hadn't expected and didn't deserve, but he accepted them anyway. "And you would have been an incredible daughter. If circumstances had been different." Keisha smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Maybe we can still be family. Just not the way we originally imagined. Maybe we already are." As they walked away from the construction site, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of remembering with purpose. Lucy would never come home, and Keisha's parents would never return, but their memories would live on in every family that found stable housing through their work. Love at last, Charles realized. Not romantic love or the simple bond between parent and child, but the complex, hard-won love between two people who'd chosen to heal together instead of suffering alone. Some stories ended with reunion. Others ended with redemption. The best ones ended with both.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.